be a sponge, and then bring the juice.
By focusing on your improvement, by focusing on your progress, and eliminating any fixed mindset that you may have and acts of perfectionism, then you encourage your own mastery.
On some level, we do what we want to do 24 hours a day. Now, sometimes it may not seem like that, but if I'm choosing to work instead of sleep, what I'm actually saying is keeping my job is more important than sleeping.
I'm tired of this. I'm tired of getting beat. What can I do to get over this hump? So mentally, that's when I kind of put that forefront, like, hey, it's either all or nothing.
I like to put failure in quotations because I don't believe that failure is true failure if you're looking at it with the right mindset.
The truth is, the journey to greatness is hard. It takes time, it takes effort, it takes focus, and every day you have to decide what you value, what you want to pursue, and what you want to achieve. And if you dig deep enough, if you push hard enough, we all have what it takes to be great. Welcome to the Edge of Greatness. Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Edge of Greatness podcast. I'm your host, Charles Schultz, and today I'm joined by Dave Kline. Dave is a leadership expert and consultant who is now running his own show, doing some cohorts and expanding his knowledge to help managers and leaders do better. So I'm very excited to have him on today to talk about leadership. Thank you so much, Dave, for joining me.
Charles, thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Absolutely. So I'm going to start you off with kind of a big one, though. So I'm going to dig back into the piggy bank a little bit for you. I want you to think back in time and tell me about your first leadership lesson that really hit home for you and made you go, man, I've got a lot to learn and this is going to be fun. I'm going to get so much better.
Interesting. So my first leadership lesson, I'm just going to go with what popped to mind.
Yeah.
It was my second job. So I started as a consultant and then I had a brief stint working at Columbia University. It's not something it was pretty short. It was a project. And I was brought in to oversee, 25 or so people. We were doing a big, implementation for an HR system. And I remember sitting down as the project started to teeter off course with one particular group. And I remember sitting down and saying, take me into the problem, what's going on? And the two people sitting across from me were like, we're mainframe programmers. You're having us program a web application. We don't know how to do that. And I was like, well, that seems like a problem. And so how, we should get you some training. We should get, we got to do this. And they were like, but we don't want training. We want to program mainframe computers. We've been working, they had been working at Columbia since before I was born. As it was one of those moments where I was like, oh shit, this is way more complicated. It's not just here's the title, but you're like, I really have to start to build a deep understanding of everybody on my team and what they're like, what they're capable of, what they're different. I have to thoughtfully match the work, not just that I need done, but that they're capable of doing and ideally excited to do. I have to constantly be thinking about that system and how that's going to go. And it was just this moment where I was way over my skis. And somehow it just hit me, and then at the same time, I have these humans sitting across from me who are scared, right? It's this new technology, they're getting later into their career. They certainly don't want to go through that overhaul or the implications if I were to make a bigger change, et cetera. And so just seeing all those contours come to life in that moment, was pretty profound, and I think has led me now to really enjoy studying and trying to figure out how to crack that each time.
That's an interesting place to be for your first time, and you've got some people who have experience but don't want to necessarily do what you're asking or learn how to do what you're asking because they're comfortable with their position. So I guess that leads me back to then not necessarily what you did in that moment, but what does leadership mean to you?
Yeah, when I think about leadership, I think first and foremost, it's a bit about meeting people where they are, right? Everybody has a different mindset. They value different things. They bring different abilities and experiences to bear, right? And the more that you understand that, then the more you can go meet them where they are. versus trying to get them to conform to you. And so let me give you an example. Like when one of the things you may have noticed is I really like studying athletic coaches or sports coaches, like people who have, the thing I really like about it is a lot of the same problems we have leading any sort of team often are acute, right? I think I have recruiting problems. Well, Nick Saban has to recruit a team every 4 years. I think that I have leadership problems. I'm not dealing with people who, make $25 million a year. Like it's all a little bit more like, it's all a little bit heightened, and there's a scoreboard. Like you sort of know, like, did the system produce the outcome or didn't it? And so, one of the things that was interesting, I dug into Sean McVay a little bit, and fortuitously, like just before he went on his Super Bowl run. But it was interesting because he talked about his system and how he's constantly trying to optimize his system to the people he has, and so if you go back to when he started with the Rams and he had Jared Goff, a quarterback of a certain caliber and a certain style, and he kind of tailored the offense around him, made it simpler, took some of the plays out of the book, and then ultimately realized like the system could only create a foundation so far, and the talent was now going to be the constraint. Flash forward, makes big trades, goes out and gets some more talent, now allows him to retailer the system to a level up. And the net result this year is obviously winning the Super Bowl, right? And so that idea of like meeting people where they are, he had to size that up, then size up that his system couldn't actually take the people he had any further, then upgrade the talent. And so it's this balancing act between knowing what you have, matching to your system and your goals, and then flipping to the other side and saying like, well, can I upgrade the talent? Can I improve the talent? Can I realign the talent, et cetera?
So what kind of advice would you give to somebody who doesn't have the flexibility of a McVay and being able to go out and make quick acquisitions and trades to upgrade the talent level? Where do we tell those leaders to kind of lean into? Let's say like a high school sports coach can't go and trade for the neighboring town's quarterback. We got to work with what we have. So where would you direct that leader to maybe begin the journey of building the team up?
I'd probably send them two different directions. So maybe we want to take both, right? I do think people will often create constraints for themselves that aren't necessarily there. So they might say like, I can't do that. But that same high school coach is going to get new athletes every year, right? Or if you go into business context, inevitably, I was just researching this because I was curious and I saw headlines I didn't believe, that 75% of people are actively looking for their next job right now. And I was like, no way, that can't be true. And so far, my poll on Twitter would say that I'm wrong and they're right. And so interesting, that's good news, bad news for any manager, right? That means look around your team. Even if you have the happiest team, half of those people are thinking about leaving. When they leave, that's your opportunity. So the first angle I'm on is like, I'm always recruiting. So, right? Whether if you're a high school sports coach, there are other athletes who don't play your sport. Maybe they should, right? You're a business professional and you are thinking, you have a team of analysts. You should be knowing the 10 analysts you will call when the next one leaves, because each one of those is your opportunity to upgrade that spot, to bring in someone more culturally aligned to whatever mission you're on, to bring in a new set of capabilities you don't currently have and give your system more flexibility. So I do think if you take a long enough horizon, instead of tomorrow, but over a year or 5 years or 10 years, and you're always recruiting, no matter where you are, you'll be able to apply that. That's one side. I think the second side is probably more the direction you were tilting, which is I think we underestimate how much people can change, but we often direct our energy at changing the wrong thing. So what I mean by that is I fundamentally believe if I stare at myself through time, everyone I know, like they have changed, they have grown and evolved. And that can be even at fundamental things like what you truly valued. Like I would say I've always valued family, but if I compared to the 22-year-old me and how that manifested in behaviors to the 44-year-old me and how that manifests in behavior, I believe I value family more now than I did then. I don't know if that makes me a bad person, but I see that evolution. And if something that fundamental can evolve, I think that really people can change anything they really want to some degree. The mistake I think a lot of people make is they focus almost all their energy in the direction of weaknesses. Like I'm bad at this, I dislike that, et cetera. And they have less of an appreciation and invest less in their superpower, right? So in my 10 years at Bridgewater, we spent a lot of time on weaknesses. Like this is one of the places where I actually, in hindsight, I don't think we quite had the system set up optimally. And so let me just try to make that real. Like if I were leading a team right now and I had somebody and let's say they were super powered in one way and they had this like liability in another. When I'm coaching people, I'm saying, I want you to take that liability, that weakness, and I want you to just bring it to neutral. Like, don't try to be excellent at it. Just try not to be, have it not be the distraction. Right. And so if you were working on a call center, right, and you're very gregarious and outgoing and customer centric, but you're a little bit disorganized, and the call center requires you to put tickets into a CRM system, but you forget to do it. Like, I don't need you to go from being a little bit disorganized and forgetting to put your tickets in to becoming like an accountant, right? I just need you to close this tiny gap called put your tickets in. So whatever that little habit is, whatever that little thing is, like just get it. It's like, what's the minimum viable investment is how I think about it. And that brings the hurdle way down for people. And then you're just getting that thing back to not being a liability. On the other side of the spectrum is where I'd want you doubling down. You're like, oh, okay, that person's gregarious and outgoing, that call center person. Okay, how am I going to get that person to be super powered, right? Can I start to assign her or him to the, to our VIP candidates or VIP clients and have them engage that? Could I have them teach other call center people how to be outgrowing and gregarious? Could I have them work with somebody else who's even better at that and like distill it into principles that the group follows, et cetera? But just what is it that is going to be this like optimizing move on the superpower side? And if you took that to say sports, right? It's like, you're not going to pull your right fielder and have them come in and pitch, right? You're going to have them get better at throwing people out at second. You're going to have them cover the corner better. You're going to hopefully have them hit for power. You're going to continue to lean into the reasons they're there. So I think those would be my kind of two pieces of advice.
I really like that. I like the amplification of a strength to make it become better. How can we maximize this potential and then not necessarily eliminate weaknesses? Because I think a lot of times we lean into too many like projects and goals to eliminate weaknesses that are, it's just a waste of time when you know that the strength is going to be the better thing for the outcome of the organization or the program or whatever you're working with. So I think that's an interesting way to look at it. And I think that could be very useful for sure.
100%. The one other piece I'd layer in, you sort of hinted at there, is like, pick one.
Yeah.
Like the number of times I've talked to people and they're like, oh, I'm working on, I want to be faster and jump higher and run longer and cut weight. And you're just like, you don't, like, the reserves aren't there. Like, you just can't. What you really want to do is pick one thing where you can build a habit, whether that's the neutralizing side or the strength maximizing side. Like, pick one thing and build that habit and create that behavior until you don't even think about it anymore. And then maybe go pick another one. But trying to do 12 things at once means literally nothing will change. You'll get no positive reinforcement and see very little progress, and you'll move on to the next shiny thing.
That makes sense. You mentioned superpowers, and I like the idea of superpowers, but I'm curious, what is your leadership superpower?
I think I have two.
Okay.
So one of them that I've been very good at for a long time is I was shorthanded as like the recipe builder. So I'm not usually the totally white canvas, can take everything, can like, I'm not Elon Musk. I can't just like see the world 20, 50 years in the future and like divine that. But I can take like very limited sketches. So someone's like, I have this idea with like very little parameter, and I can hammer that down to the 90%. So I can, I won't be Wolfgang Puck, but if Wolfgang Puck says, here's a few ideas, I can turn that into the thing that goes in the cookbook. And then I sort of run out of gas at the 90%. You know what I mean? Like, I love making the recipe, getting it into the market, testing it, iterating it, like galvanizing a team around that. And then if we need to really polish it because we're going to turn that into like food production, that could be somebody else. I sort of run out. It's the recipe building between like the 10 and the 90, I think, is one of my superpowers.
I like
and
that.
Then I think the other one is I'm an exceptionally patient developer of talent.
Okay.
So
I like that. I'm going to give you something here. If you like it, you can run with it. It's yours. But I'm thinking about how you can use that superpower. That first one is, you're the guy, when they hand you a bunch of ingredients, you can make the cake, but then you pass it off to a decorator to finish the product. So you take all these pieces, you can make something special that tastes good and it's pretty well close to done. But then if you want it shiny because it's going to a wedding, you're going to pass it off and have them put the finishing touches on it. And I think that could be a cool way for you to use that superpower to explain that story a little bit. And I thought that was kind of an interesting way to look at it. So one of the things that keeps coming up when I look at leadership is just how complex and multifaceted it is. And it can become easily overwhelming, especially for a young leader or a new leader. Where would you direct people to start when it comes to understanding or unpacking becoming a better leader?
Usually when I'm coaching early leaders on that, I sort of want them doing two things at once, right? So one is, I would call it like bringing intention to your management brand or bringing intention to your management style. Like, so there's a lot of work on self-awareness. Like, who are you? What do you like? Some of those same like superpowers and weaknesses we were describing, really elevate that and explicitly like write it down, ask people, like have them give you feedback to say like, I think this is the picture of me. Is this the picture of me? Like, oh, no. Great. More data. And so on one side, you're really building that picture because you then want to apply it, right? You don't want to go read a management book about someone who's totally different than you and how they succeeded, because that's not going to work for you. So you want to use that picture and you want to like get the right stimulus to like, oh, that would work for me. That fits. This type of player will operate that way. And then you want to generate data, right? You want to make decisions. You want to try on different costumes. You want to apply different tactics and then be honest with yourself about, well, did it work or did it not work? Like, was the team really inspired by that approach or did it fall flat? And continue to like improve that system side. And then you're just comparing back and forth. Like, this is the picture of me. This is the picture of my system. And through time, those two things should start to converge into kind of the leader that you are.
How much does your picture change over time of yourself as a leader?
I think it can change quite a bit for two reasons. One is the context, right? You're not always going to be leading the exact same thing. Like maybe you're a coach and you're always going to have a team, but like I see it with my kids. Like my kids are 1 year apart in school. And the culture of the grades are like two different worlds. And you're like, how could that be? They're a year apart. It's the same school, it's the same environment, a lot of the same families. And yet, I've got one group that's like focused and academic and studious, and one that's like super athletic, but also kind of like rule breaking and riotous. And so you're like, even if you're that teacher, even my kid's math teacher is like, wow, I have two totally different leadership challenges 2 years in a row, even though I'm in the exact same. So I think your context is going to keep changing. And then I would say the other piece is just, I think you yourself change, right? Like I think of it as almost like building a mental Rolodex. Yeah. Like you're kind of building you're pattern matching through time. You're going to experience a new thing and abstract it out. And so you're adding all of that in to then how you'll be able to approach a situation. And so I think it's like the weightlifting equivalent of management or leadership, right? Where you're getting stronger and you're learning the techniques it would be sort of the analogy would be like, you're not going to be the same person in the gym at 22 that you will be at 42. Like hopefully you'll be better and different in many ways. Some of it is because of your technique and some of it is because of your physiology.
How much has your picture changed during your experience as a leader?
A lot. I was an asshole.
So tell me more about that. Like, I'm curious as far as, because sometimes you need that moment where you fail in that setting. Cause I did too. I had a management opportunity and it was awful for me. I was a completely different person when I got that role. Mm-hmm. But I think I'm a much better leader now because I failed so horrifically in that first opportunity that it's led me to now being more aware of those things. So I'm curious, tell me about that moment.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if there was a singular moment, but I think the arc is pretty common, right? Where I was very lucky. Like we came from a really a lower middle class background, 2 working parents, divorce, et cetera. So lots of that. And so I had this real pride in like, I can do things myself. And that led me to kind of get into a pretty good school and get some scholarships for that. And then, started a Big Four consulting firm and then continued to, and so into like another company that was, Fortune 500. So you're like, wow, it's a pretty good arc. Right. And inside of most of that was, academic success, athletic success. But a lot of it is, me, that's what I would attribute it to. Like, oh, I picked myself up by my bootstraps and I made it happen. And then as you started to move into leadership, all the things that got me there, started to fail me. Right. I couldn't try myself harder into leading a team. Right. It wasn't about me caring about my work enough. I now had to care about their work, their success. It wasn't about shining the light on my wins. It was about shining the light on their wins and the losses I got to own for them, and so different things like that. And it just took me, I'm still probably learning some of these lessons, but it certainly took me, I would say, like a good 5 or 8 years to kind of trip over almost every single one of those mistakes, to then say like, oh, I probably shouldn't do that. Like, oh, treating people this way isn't effective. Like, oh, that was not a good email to send. That was an in-person conversation. And then it's interesting because it all sort of boils down to just be a good human, but it's funny. A lot of the stuff we were taught and a lot of the things we were rewarded for along the way through school and early in your career actually puts that at odds in certain ways. So
you said something very interesting in there, that your success was mainly because of you. And I find that that's interesting because I think that when I look at leadership and I look at people who kind of take the reins and want to oversee everything, I hear a lot of complaints from people that I know, people that are on teams, of being micromanaged. Do you think that that's a common thing because people want to be in control? Or what leads to that person or those people having micromanagement as like, that's a wholesale issue I hear so often?
Oh man, we could do an entire episode on micromanagement. We were going through this with my cohort recently. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of different motivation. Like there's a lot of fear is the underlying thing. And then the fears are all very different. And so partly if you yourself are a micromanager, or if you are dealing with a micromanager, the first thing to figure out is like which fear is driving it. And so you named one of them, right? A loss of control. Like I used to be in control. Everything was my assignment turned in with my name. And so if it was good, it was good. If it was bad, it was bad, but it was all mine. And now I've had to lose control. I'm like turning over the reins, but there's a lot more. There's another one that's like losing your authority, right? Like you've built this expertise in your organization. Like you're the best Java developer. And now you're a manager of Java developers, which means someone else is going to assume the role as the best Java developer. And that can be a loss of identity for people. They're very afraid of that. Another one is this idea of unplanned obsolescence, right? So the idea, if you do what planned obsolescence is, right? They make iPhones to kind of break after 2 or 3 years, so you have to go get a new one. And so this idea, if I'm delegating away all my work, am I not now obsolescent? Like, what do you need me for? And so people get very worried about that, which is like, I'm going to put myself out of a job and actually end up out of a job. And so you want to get behind the fear of that to then say like, well, what is the tactic that I need to deploy to stop doing that? Like, if I'm the manager who's like, I am all over these guys, and I'm also not getting the leverage I wanted to get from delegating if I do that too. So like making peace with that fear and then saying like, well, how do I structure it? And so like when I'm coaching people to say like, how would I deal with that? You want to set a really good expectation about what you're delegating, right? And not just the what, but the how, because usually you have a point of view. And that's where most of the fights come from, which is like, oh, I wanted you to do this thing, but I kind of wanted you to do it this way. And if you reconcile that up front and say like, I absolutely want you to do it this way, and like they can agree or disagree, or you could say like, no, I want you to do this, and here's 3 ways you could do it, or you could say like, I did it, and I got lazy with it and the inertia. I'd love you to redo it your own way. You know what I mean? But just them knowing like what the parameters are becomes really important. And then you sort of have to set the backside up, which is like, you still have to manage it. Like you painted one of the 2 sides of bad leadership. One is like, I'm all over it and smother it. The other one is I like dump it and walk away. Right. And so what you end up doing is just the key part there is just being consistent, right? Like, okay, I'm going to put the responsibility on you to tell me what's going on with this new goal I gave you. Can we do that once, in our one-on-one check-ins every week? And can you please bring like these 2 metrics to kind of show me how it's going? That type of just, okay, good. Now like how I'm going to engage you to stay close to it versus me randomly zooming around and doing strange stuff. Because usually it's that inconsistency that erodes the trust.
So do you recommend creating a system that has specific checks for like follow up and making sure that you are managing enough without micromanaging?
In general, I recommend pretty intentional management.
Okay.
But I don't think it goes to the prescription of it must be this type of check at this date. What I would want people to do is be very thoughtful about the appropriate ones. Right. So you might say, hey, look, the thing I'm delegating to you, it doesn't like, I don't need to even be involved ever again, but I'm going to be very explicit about that. Or it might say like, hey, this is like, think of a nuclear reactor. Like this is mission critical. And I'm handing over to you the like cooling plant. I don't want you to pull a lever in the cooling plant until I sign off. Right. I've delegated it to you, but I've created a gate. I've created a control. And so it's less that there's a specific right answer, but more that you've sized up the person you're giving it to, the risk associated with the situation, and then created the right mechanisms to deal with that intentionally.
Okay. That makes sense. When you are thinking about leaders and creating teams within your main team, where do you feel most leaders make a mistake as far as the delegation process? Where do we lose, I guess, not necessarily our control, but our direction of what we're trying to accomplish when we're trying to get better at delegating? Where do we go wrong with that delegation process?
I think it's usually I might end up just saying the same thing a little bit.
Okay.
Like I think the biggest one is it's in the expectation setting.
Gotcha.
And then I think it's more specifically the how than the what. Like it's very easy to say, I need you to take over this hiring process and hire 5 analysts. And I've seen cases where people have gone after that goal and achieved it, but 70% of the recruiting team resigned. We burned relationships at 2 of 5 like schools and et cetera, right? So you kind of imagine that. And so you're like, well, if you're just being goal-oriented in your expectation setting, right? I didn't say that you couldn't make everyone quit. I didn't say you had to like maintain good relationships with these schools or whatever else, but that was that was of course in there and applied to some degree. And so like, why not take the extra 5 minutes up front to say like, yeah, I want you to do this, get these 5 people. I'm going to build a sustainable, system that we can do this every year. I want to have really great vendor relationships. I want to make sure the team morale is exceptionally high because when they're interacting with candidates, that's going to be a representation of our brand, et cetera. And so it is inside of that aligned how. And then people don't make it a dialogue. Like that's the other piece, which is like, okay, I'm handing you, Charles, I'm giving you this assignment. Like, how are you going to do it? Like, do you have what you need? Do you have the resources? Have you been trained? Going back to the opening story, right? Have you been trained on computer program that's not mainframe? And so that idea of like a 2-way dialogue, and I always call it aligning on expectations because it's meant you should co-author them, right? If I just give it to you, it becomes a rule. If you and I co-author it, now it's a standard, it's an agreement. And I think focusing on the how you're going to achieve it, because either way, you're going to invest the same amount of time. You can invest it up front, getting aligned, or you can invest it on the back end, dealing with problems. But it ends up being neutral. So you might as well do the investment side versus the correction side.
Yeah, no, for sure. For sure. Interesting thought though, is it sounds to me that communication is the ultimate key to all of this. So how much time do you spend working on your communication skills to help better your leadership and management skills?
I would say in hindsight, not enough, truthfully.
Yeah.
Like one of my reflections coming out of 20 years working in corporate America, and then for the last year, solopreneuring, buying a business, now building, this management leadership program, is I don't think I did enough. It's been interesting to hear people who are surprised to find me on Twitter and then are reading my stuff and they're like, wow, that's like really clear and good. Or even my wife's like, wow, in 6 months, you sort of went from fuzzy and drawn out to like sharper, more precise language. And that sort of spurred this reflection of I wasn't spending enough time really honing that craft, whether, written communication and like really like finding my voice or moments like this. And so it's something I'm trying to correct now, but I don't think I was putting enough into it. And I imagine I wasn't getting any nudge from my company that should be an investment either.
Yeah. With how many things need clarification and that importance of detail, why do you think we skip out on the communication side, the conversation side, the asking questions, those types of things when it comes to leadership training?
I think the soft skills often get kind of the short shift in this whole thing. It's like, they're a little bit less measurable, right? Like if I know that if I have an analyst and I teach them Excel, I'll be pretty easy to measure whether they can make a pivot table, right? If I make Dave Kline 10% more articulate or slightly more pithy in his writing, it's like a harder thing to prove and measure. And so in a world of like constrained resources, budget cuts, et cetera, that's just a harder pitch, I think. I think the other one is like, it's easier for me in hindsight to now want that training. You know what I mean? Like it's very directly tied to my livelihood, how clear I communicate, whether in this format, in my classes, in my writing, et cetera. And so that's the other piece that I'm seeing in the cohort classes, and I'm wrestling with how that works in the corporate environment, is kind of training that you want and you opt into versus training that is put upon you, right? So would I have engaged in the same way and bet as interested if Bridgewater 5 years ago had said, here's a writing class, versus me in my moment, like saying like the biggest thing for me to go invest my self-improvement in is a writing class, And so when I'm even like struggling this with my own cohort class right now, where I've got 40 people who all raised their hand from around the world and said like, we want to get together and learn these like 8 modules. Like this stuff really matters and we want to learn it right now. And so it's this very high energy. And the reason they want to learn that thing right now is because they're having those literal problems: delegating, setting expectations, recruiting great talent, making that turn from a contributor to a manager, et cetera. Right? I've had companies approach me and say, I'd love to put all 15 of my managers through that. And I've said to all of them, my one main concern is like the dynamic shifts pretty materially when it goes from being 40 people who all showed up and said like, I want to be right here, right now, to 15 people who showed up because it was on their calendar. So it's a little bit of a long-winded answer to your question on the soft skills, but it's, I think that's a big factor. It's just like, did you opt in or was it put upon you?
Yeah, no, I totally understand where you're coming from, because I think we all go through those phases of where we want to direct our learning and where we want to direct our focus. And, for me, it happened where I decided to invest in my education and go back to, get my master's. Because prior to like that moment, I hate school. I hated learning. Not that I hated learning. I hated being told what to learn. And the master's program was my first time choosing what I was going to learn. And I was much more invested, much more focused, much more present. And so I guess when it comes to building better leaders, how do we get them to want knowledge more readily, more consistently? Because I think there's a lot of people out there who get put into leadership positions. Maybe they don't want it, but then they don't really necessarily attack the learning part of it, at least not up front until they have some failures. How do we curb some of those failures for them and help them?
I have a thought, but can I ask you a question first?
Yeah, please.
When you were doing your master's, were you also able to apply some of what you were learning in parallel, or was it strictly academic?
I was coaching at the time, so I did have the opportunity to apply some of the classes, some of the lessons, some of the things that we were going over in real time. As I was learning it, I was trying to do more with my coaching. Yes.
Because it was interesting. So I got my master's as well, and felt I did a part-time MBA. So I was literally managing a team and getting my MBA. So that was part of my thesis is, one, I think you need to be able to put it into practice. Like, that's why I think the cohort format's so interesting, is most of the people are doing it so they can literally go solve a problem tomorrow. Like, like we try to do a thing in our class where instead of me doing theoretical exercises, they're building out a development plan, or they're literally writing out a script for giving feedback to a literal person on their team. Right. And so in the same way, I think organizations just have to start to figure out, can you make it a bit more on demand? Do you know what I mean? So instead of some sort of like top-down like university style program where one size fits all, an option would just be like, give them money and mandate they spend it. Right? Just like, you have $2,000 a year. We expect you to get yourself trained on the most relevant thing to you. If that's creative writing, great. If that's post-production for movies, great. If that's management, great. But like, we want you to invest on the thing you need right now, and maybe even like offer some incentive for them to collaborate with other people. Like, oh, the three of you from here are going to take this together. Great. Because I think if you did that, you end up with the accountability of peers in your group. You're opting in. The only real like nudge they've given you is like, they expect you to spend the money. And so I think and then you could go be applying it. Like, you're probably picking a thing you can apply. And so I sort of think that creates a much better set of ingredients than the other way.
I absolutely love that idea. And I'm curious as to why more places or businesses or companies don't go that route. There's so many, I worked at a place that had their like own university, and you went through their own training, and it was everybody got the same stuff. But I couldn't tell you a single thing from that education process. And this was me being trained to be a manager at a facility. And I couldn't tell you a single thing I was there for 5 days doing training. They flew me out. They did all this training. Couldn't tell you a thing because I didn't opt in, so why do we not do this more? Why do more companies not do this? Why are we so hesitant to give our leaders the freedom? I mean, we talk about delegation as a leader, but then we don't give our employees the freedom to go and learn what they need to.
Well, I wonder if there's two different programs. You know what I mean? Like, I think a lot of times management training often has like specific cultural goals in mind. Do you know what I mean? Like, I know I experienced this at Bridgewater where like, they weren't giving me like tactics that I needed to like delegate, but they were helping me have a better understanding of like what the shared culture and set of behaviors was. And so I don't even know, even at certain moments in time, you couldn't walk out and be like, I learned this thing. But instead what happened is, the 30 of us now have this shared language, this shared mythology, these shared sort of behaviors that we see as being encouraged or discouraged. And I think there's a place for that, right? And you can come up with different ways to do it. And I think you and I are talking about a second thing, right? Yeah. Which is when you get out of this world of culture building and team building and adhesion, and you're into like individual optimization so that when they're in the culture and the teams, they can be even better. For the individual one, I think, I don't think there's a great answer. You know what I mean? I think what's interesting is some companies do it. And a lot of people don't spend it, which I find interesting. And then the other one is they'll do it, but they make it very constrained. So they'll say like, yes, you have $1,000, but you will spend it in this platform, or you will spend it on one of these 3 approved things that must produce a certificate. Like, they'll create a lot of barriers. Okay. And so I think those would be the only two things. You could tweak both those things, right? You could give them more freedom, and you could nudge them to spend it.
Okay, that makes sense. And I guess this kind of comes back to, you have these people who are getting money to learn and they're choosing not to spend it. That kind of relates back to like what we were talking about before we went on air here. And in your cohort, you said 25% are really active, 50% are there, but not participating. And then another 25 are just kind of like missing out. And maybe not necessarily in your cohort, but what you've seen in other environments is that 25, 50, 25. Do you think that plays into our whole society? Is that kind of what we are as a human species, is we have these 25 people that want to run and take control, and then 50 just kind of want to go with the motion, and then another 25 are just kind of hanging on to their title and cool with it?
Well, it's been interesting. Like, I've been really lucky with mine in the sense of, I had a wait list of about 200 people. So I was able to kind of cherry pick very well. And I was optimizing for engagement. So I sort of have a little bit of a skew. like even to the point that I have 3 or 4 people who can't make the time, but they then do the course and they follow up to me separately. When people aren't coming, they let me know in advance. So it's like, I'm lucky. I have like the outlier group. Part of it, I think I tried to help orchestrate is I set that expectation with them up front, which is I painted that same bell curve that I had experienced and I had heard from a lot of other creators, and just said like, I am teaching a group about expectations, and let me set mine with you, right? Here's what you're going to get from me. The expectation everyone said is it will be this bell curve, and I expect that this group is capable of so much more. And so I don't 100% know the answer to your question, like in the sense of, I tend to be more optimistic and think that is not the human condition, that we can find our moments to be aligned. I tend to, as I think when you asked how I changed as a leader, I use the word grace a lot more. Like I've learned so often when I assume intent, I was wrong. You know what I mean? That I assume, oh, you're not doing that because you're lazy or because you don't have the right values. And they're like, I'm doing that because like my mother's really sick and I haven't slept in 4 days, or I'm doing that because, my family went through this terrible thing, or I'm doing this for any another number of reasons. And so even in that, mostly even for the couple of people in my group where that happened, I just reached out and was like, what can I do? Like, are you okay? What do you need? And there's a couple tough stories on the other side of that. And so they're going to be in cohort 2, but that'll be my other thing, is just give people grace. Like I don't think most people are like malicious or lazy or anything. I think life happens and it's hard, and especially now as much as ever.
Do you think it's possible too that sometimes participation in a group like that, because there are so many people who want to be heard, that the introvert kind of falls back and just says, I'm just going to listen and learn?
Yeah. And I think it's, again, there's no judgment in the listening and learning.
Yeah.
If anything, again, this is another place where my style evolved a lot, especially like where Bridgewater, we spent so much time creating what we called like the picture of people, right? Like really, having come from consulting and learning a lesson very early in my career, I sheepishly walked in to resign because I was going to leave to go take that Columbia job, and was like, I don't know how my boss is going to take this. I'm like an irreplaceable snowflake. And he kind of like shook my hand and wished me well and picked up the phone and had my replacement there on Monday, and I was like, wait, we're just cogs? What happened? Which was actually for the purposes of managing people, it's a terrible lesson, because most businesses aren't structured where everyone's sort of like a replaceable cog. And even if they are, behind that is actually really unique humans with different mindsets, values, motivations. And so really starting to hone in on that. And so like, if you're thinking about introverts and extroverts, like if you're an intentional manager, you have both. And so you're going to create conditions for both to thrive. You're going to find the ways to engage that. So you're getting the full set of what that team can bring to bear. And you're going to kind of give a little latitude that not everyone needs to show up in exactly the same way. And so I sort of feel the same way with the course. So I've reached out to some of them on DM, and I've probably had 9 or 10 one-on-ones just for that reason.
That makes sense. And so getting more into that introvert extrovert part of leadership, a lot of times when we're younger or we're on a team, let's say high school, college, the loudest person is typically chosen as the captain or the leader of the team. Is the loudest person on the team the best leader?
No, but they're chosen. So then you sort of have to decide.
How do we get away from choosing the loudest and finding the best?
It's a great question. I mean, again, you're talking about a really intentional leader above that's either going to make the choice, or when you go to the sports analogy, it gets tricky, right? Because a lot of times the captains are elected by the people, right? They're elected by the rest of the team. And so now you're talking about needing not one person to kind of see past that and size up people differently, but also 25, 30, 50, 90 people to see that. And there's a question, especially when you go to the sports analogy, of like, I don't know, a lot of times you want your captain to be the one on the field, John. You kind of want the most vocal person to do that. And so I'm not as 100% sold it's a problem. Okay. And then at least in that environment, and then I'm not sure how you solve it. I did a piece on Coach K recently. And sort of similar to what McVay was saying is he talked a lot about tailoring the system to each class. And so I'm gonna blank on which class it was, but he had two captains. You know, the captains were elected, and part of his system was to try to let the captains be the first person in the other player's face. I mean, we've all seen him on the sideline, very animated, even in his 70s. But for the most part, try to have the players and the captains do that. And the two captains who were elected were like the two quietest. And so instead of, it kind of ties to the whole strength weakness thing. So instead of trying to convince these captains to be something they weren't, basically he and the assistant coaches just agreed that they were going to have to become the ones who were in the face of this particular team. And so it's a bit interesting one to study. I don't know the spirit behind how those two ended up being the obvious captains.
No, that's an interesting situation, because knowing Duke, I'm assuming the team was probably pretty good, which means he adapted really well to a situation that he wasn't comfortable with. So as a leader, that would be a very interesting case study to see how he adapted in that moment to deal with the fact that he's got two quiet leaders now that he's not used to.
Well, let's say probably not a mode that he preferred. I don't know that he was uncomfortable with it.
That's fair.
If you go through the full 40 years, you're right. Very, very willing to get in people's face.
That's probably true. Yes. But it was definitely a shift and a change of pace that he took on, knowing his team and in that particular unit. So
100%, which just gets us back to that intentional management, right? Absolutely. Sizing up the people, building your system to maximize them.
Okay. So I'm going to shift gears just real quick. I'm going to finish up. I got one more question that I thought was really interesting when I was looking through kind of preparing for this, but I want to end with this one. So you put out a tweet the other day that said 99% of things we worry about can be solved by taking one step. Tell me more about how you've applied this in your life.
Man, I could pick a lot. It was partly the way I use Twitter is sort of reminding myself of things.
Okay.
Often sometimes that resonates, sometimes it falls totally flat, but it's almost like my ongoing, I write a lot about discipline. You could imagine that's me reminding myself to be disciplined or consistent, etc. This one was sort of twofold. One is, the number of times that I have not slept the night before, filled myself with anxiety about like the most terrible thing that was going to happen related to a project, to an interaction, to a podcast, whatever it is. And then as soon as we stepped on that first step on the field, that first question in the podcast, that first meeting with the project team, it all sort of evaporates. And like all these imaginary dragons that you would put around there turned out to be pretty non-existent. And so, partly it's just a reminder to me of like, no, just go, like, just get going. The other reason it's so important for me, like I talk a lot about testing and iterating, like just, whether that's how I built the class, which like, I had a landing page to be like, do people want to take this class? And I was hoping to get 10 or 20 people who were interested. And then it was 200. And I was like, whoa, okay. But that's good. I'm glad I didn't spend a lot of work to build it. So I'm glad I didn't build it before I knew that. But that data became really important, and it even changed my aspirations of my roadmap, And so that idea of like, we'll take a step, because the worst thing that happens is you just get more data. It might've been the wrong direction. It might be the right direction, too slow, you know what I mean? But you won't know until you start to get that feedback. And so that's how I did it. Like that's, using the course as the example is one of them, but that's how I started writing on Twitter. That's how, my wife jokes when we bought the web business. She was kind of like, you don't know how to run a web business. And I'm like, well, I will certainly have to take a step if we buy it. And so here we go.
I like that philosophy. I think that can serve a lot of people well, because I think too many people think about great things to do, but then they never pull the trigger and they wait and they delay it, and then it never happens. So I think if we swing and miss a few times, it's okay, as long as we're continuing to take steps.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and again, you can be smart about it. Like, I'm not saying be reckless, you know what I mean? Like, don't take steps that have a little bit of upside and a risk of ruin on the other, but it was pretty low risk to put up a web page and find out if people wanted to learn how to be better managers, Right. It's pretty low risk to, have me on your podcast. Like, worst case scenario, this episode doesn't get listened to. It's just not that risky.
Yeah, no, I love that. And I hope a lot of people do listen to it, because I think you provided a whole lot of value today, and I greatly appreciate your time coming on, Dave. Before we finish, what I want to do is give you an opportunity. If somebody listening goes, man, I want to learn more, where can they see your work? Where can they follow up if they want to maybe jump in one of the future cohorts? What's the best way to get to you?
Yeah, I would say the easiest path and where I'm most active is Twitter. So my handle is Dave II. And you can find links to my new manager accelerator on there, which is a course I'm hosting on Maven. But again, my DMs are open. I'm pretty active. So drop in, say hi. Always happy to answer a question.
Well, I greatly appreciate your time. It's been a fantastic conversation. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Charles, thanks you for having me. Love the question.
Absolutely. As always, guys, keep reaching for the stars. Fall flat on your face, but remember, whenever we fall, always get up. Thank you for joining us today on the Edge of Greatness podcast. If you haven't yet, please take a minute now to subscribe and review our show. Join us again next week as we continue to dig deeper into the key components of greatness. The path to greatness is never linear, so remember to keep pursuing greatness no matter what. Keep stretching your abilities, reach for the stars, and fall flat on your face. But remember, no matter what happens, whenever we fall, always get up. Until next time, I'm Charles Schultz, and this was the Edge of Greatness podcast.